God is your goal. You know, I will tell you, people have less of an attention span today than they had 10 years ago. And they have less of an attention span then than they had 10 years before that. Has anybody read any work by C.H. Spurgeon? If you haven't read Spurgeon, get a hold of some of his stuff. It's ridiculously good. It is absolutely ridiculous. Spurgeon never went to college. He is the prince of preachers. He had the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London, the most populous church, 3,500 people going to that church before there was a sound system. And so he preached very loudly. And just when I read his stuff, you just go, how did anybody put together this artistic of a line? Never went to school. Never went to that kind of school. Well, you may have heard this, but none of the 12 disciples did either. Amazing that Jesus chose them. And actually, they got their own books, a lot of them, in the Bible yet. And so they got to do that. So you wonder, why does it take this mountain of stuff now to qualify? Well, we have learned in the last 20 to 30 years that the mountain of stuff you have to do to be in ministry is perhaps not as applicable as it was even 20 or 50 years ago. I've got more degrees than I need, and they are not what taught me about pastorate. What taught me about the pastorate is pastoring, because they cannot possibly prepare you for what you will actually face on the ground when you get out here in school. So we do have, as most of you have heard, we have a program now that we have availed ourselves of, and Sierra Pines will become an anchor to that program, a program called Trellis. And Trellis is a way that you can go to college, basically, and we will get you through that whole experience for free. A collegiate degree that would normally cost you probably $150,000 up. The average on-site programming now is going to cost you $200,000 to $250,000 for any West Coast Christian college like Azusa Pacific, Biola, Point Loma, any of those. It's going to cost you that kind of money. But when you come out, you'll find there's less and less churches that can afford a pastor at all. In the Church of God, we've got a little over 2,000 churches across the United States. 500 of them right now are without pastors at all. And we graduated out of all 4 of those programs. We have 4 universities. We've got Warner Pacific, we've got Warner Southern in Florida, we've got Anderson, which is our main college really, back in Anderson, Indiana, and we've got Mid-America University. All 4 of those graduated together last year, 4 people into ministry. The church is in deep trouble. I've been, as you all know, you've heard me say it till you're tired of hearing me say it, but if there's no leaders coming, the church is done. It's going to close its doors. Linda and I have served at a little church down in Santa Maria that was started in 1954. Cute little place. Has run a high of 200 people. When we got there, it was running about 15. And we served there for about 3 months to see if there was any spark of life that we could pour some gasoline on. And it's not good. Once you let a church get beyond a certain point in its life, if there's no young families, I would tell you this: as soon as you see a church that doesn't have one kid in the nursery, you know you're in trouble. And you better start doing something immediately, because that nursery tells you the DNA of the rest of the church. If a church has nobody in the nursery, and worse, nobody willing to serve in the nursery if somebody came. And that's what we had down there. Luckily for them, we were able to actually find a pastor at the last strike of a second. We found a guy who would serve. I don't know if that's good or bad. We'll know within 3 months to 3 years. But we got a lot of stories out of it. I learned once again a lot. Whenever you serve, you will learn a lot, and you will never quit learning. So the 3 points of sermon, I'll be back and forth. I'm sorry, I'm tired. It's been a long 3 months. Boy, am I glad to be home. Anyway, the first one we talked about was topical. That's taking a topic and preaching about it. Just to briefly remind ourselves, how do you choose your topic? My main way is find a need and fill it. That's also the number one way to build a successful business. Find a need and fill it. If you fill it, if it's truly a need, then people will stomp to your door. And we found when we came here that people needed to be loved, and they didn't feel loved, and they had messed up. How many? Real close to 100%. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And if we create a space that is able to safely give them a moment to collect themselves and to find healing, they're coming. And they do. And they did. And so that's really what created it. Find a need and fill it. So when you're looking for a topic and you're reading through the Word, even if you're not reading through the Word at the moment, you just say, what are people feeling right now? How am I feeling right now? Do I have any apprehension about the state of the world right now? Does anybody have any apprehension? Or is it just me? Can you speak comfort to that? Does Jesus speak comfort to that? Does he say, I will be with you always, even to the end of the earth? Yeah. So there's texts that will answer every most salient need that human beings have. Find a topic, find it by finding a need, or maybe even something that's fun. Okay, so topical. Just find a topic and preach toward the topic using texts from wherever you want to. Expository means you're going to take a certain scripture or a section of scripture and you're going to preach about it and elucidate what's in there, to shine light on what's in there. So, to me, expository, for my purposes, it's one of the best, but it's also one of the easiest ways for me to approach anything. If I want to preach this weekend, I don't know what to preach on, just pick a text. Pick any text that is kind of a big one. So if I was going to say, could you tell me a little something about how you feel about Genesis chapter 1? Does anybody have any thoughts about Genesis chapter 1? That's starting with the beginning. Does anybody remember the first few words? In the beginning, which means God played baseball, right? In the big inning. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I can bounce out of that into 1 John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word, what's that mean? Can you riff on that for a while? Can you improvisationally open that up and say, this is what that means, the Word? That's incredible stuff. Anywhere you can go, in John, Jesus is talking about, I'm going to prepare a place for you. Does that evoke anything in you? Especially when you've just lost somebody. The list goes on. I mean, just to expose what's in the Word will bring people hope. That's what's incredible about the Word. I've been studying science very deeply now, well, much of my life. I've been much into science. But what I've seen about science, Sir Fred Hoyle was one of my favorite reads when I was in the 8th grade. Does anybody recognize the name? Sir Fred Hoyle was the premier astronomer from Oxford. And as an 8th grader, I was reading his stuff. I mean, you got that book of the month club for school, and I was pulling this stuff, and my mom and dad are going, why don't you just read Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill? Instead you're reading this stuff. I loved it. But I watched his position on cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the cosmos, everything. I watched his position on cosmology, which was considered the gold standard. It was steady state theory. In other words, the cosmos is everything there ever has been since the beginning of time. It's never changed. It's just always been there, ad infinitum. And it was, in fact, he made the claim, in a sense, it was eternal. Now, eternal is different than forever. Forever means from this point forward, I'm going to keep on living. I'm going to live forever. Eternal means both directions, backwards and forwards. And any good philosopher worth their worth their money will tell you time cannot go backwards. There has to be a beginning. We won't get into that today, but I got caught up into that, and that's really what I spent a lot of time in school on apologetics in terms of science. So, in the Bible says in the beginning, wait, there's a beginning? Who said that? Who said that before we knew that? Because he said back in the 1950s and 60s that was a joke that everything could come into being all at once. He jokingly called it the Big Bang when different scientists came up with the idea that everything had a beginning. He said, oh, that's a big bang, what a joke. But it stuck. Now it's the accepted cosmology. So we didn't know that, and we didn't confirm it until 1992 with the Kobe background radiation experiments measuring the radiation from the beginning of the bang of the universe, and confirmed, in fact, it did happen. And there's only one text on Earth prior to the middle 1900s that ever made such a declaration. That's this one. I hold it right here. And Peter says that he made it from nothing that could be seen that existed. Nobody knew that before. What I say about this, science keeps changing its story. Have you noticed this? It seems like every few months, every few years, everything that they knew flips on its head, and they spoke with such authority before. There's only one thing I have seen that hasn't changed, and further scientific discovery confirms and affirms as it goes along, and that's this faith we believe in. It becomes more true with every discovery. Until just a few years ago, they thought that this King David guy was just a myth. And then they discovered a coin at that level of the ground when they dug it up just a few years ago, and guess what it said on it? King David. What? I guess that part of the Bible is true. It's just, read sometime, just look up in your search bar the discoveries that archaeology has proven in the last 100 years that the Bible is true. It's true. It's becoming truer with every revelation that we discover on planet Earth. Anyway, so you have topical, then you have expositional, you're exposing. If you tell me, Bruce, you have to preach in 5 minutes and I don't have any notes with me, I'll go with expository. Just give me, I'll take a section of scripture. How about 1 Corinthians 13? Can anybody riff on that one? Yeah, you know you can, from your own personal experience. And you can do it pretty quick, you know. So those things are fun to do. So expository is fun. Then we come to the most difficult form of preaching that there is. And the most difficult form of preaching is narrative. Narrative, I thought, I had heard somebody use it before. David, what's his name, from Anderson University, the dean of Anderson came in, huh?
Dave Sebastian.
Yeah, Dave Sebastian came here a few years ago, and he said, you know, he's been doing narrative recently, and so he did narrative. Well, he was about as good at narrative as I am at narrative now. He'd reached about that stage. I'm not that good yet. I'll demonstrate that after a while. But I'm not that good yet. But if you want to know good, then you watch guys like Chris Brown. And you say, okay, I suddenly have a new thirst to get into this thing, to understand it more deeply, because he just made it come alive to me. I smelled it, I felt it, I walked it, it was all around me. He wasn't just reading two-dimensional words off the face of a page. He made me walk the street with Jesus. And that changes everything. But it is a load more work. I can preach expositionally a pretty good sermon in an hour. I can, topical, now I'm going to struggle for a minute because I'm going, what am I going to talk about? And I can spend a week until there's no time left. Usually when I get things done is the last minute, okay? So, but I'll come up with a topic, you know, because I'll struggle between too many choices. And then I'll end up with this topic, and I'll finally execute it. But it takes me some time. Not really working on the sermon, just working to try to find out where I'm going to go with the sermon. Expositionally, I already know, and the people can follow along. And if all you do, I brought this Bible because, as most of you know, I'm a Bible freak. I've got a million Bibles. This one is just a study Bible. It's the NIV study. And across the bottom of the page are all these study notes. 99% of the people in your congregation have never read them. If you use these to make your sermon, you will sound like one of the most educated people in the church anytime. And they're good. They're really, really good stuff. This one is, believe it or not, a little bit larger print. I actually bought it hardbound, and I put leather on it for Bill Bentley, and he gave it back to me when he passed away. And it's not exactly the kind of carry Bible that you want to just carry around. No. So, but it will give you some word backgrounds in some cases, other things along the way when you're studying. If you can get Strong's Concordance, you don't need a Strong's Concordance anymore. I'm just going to be frank with you. You really don't need them. When I taught Pauline Literature 2002 at Azusa Pacific, they required that I use the Oxford Bible, which is this humongous Bible with notes all over the place, and you read this text, and then you have to flip over here 538 pages to find a reference to this, and you go back over. I said, oh, come on. And I had students that were paying literally $1,000 a semester for extraneous books, and they would come to me and say, can I just use my study Bible? I'd say, let me see it. And if it was an acceptable study Bible, I said, yeah, and you're never going to need any more than that. Let me just be frank. You're not going to be going to the Oxford Reference Bible for this. And so they would do that. Believe me, that just the NIV Study Bible or the NASB Study Bible, any good study Bible with the notes. I like the notes at the bottom of the page rather than some central place like my Holman Study Bible that has all the notes, and the Master Study Bible at the end, and you're flipping back and forth. It's just, you can put a sermon together much more quickly and gain knowledge much more quickly with a reference like that. So that's how you go about that. Now we're back. I'm sorry if I'm all over the place here. Narrative. The narrative method requires, when you're going to tell this thing, when you're going to tell a story, you're going to read a story in the Bible, it's already a narrative. Jesus used narrative almost exclusively. So when he tells the story about the wayward son who runs off with his share of the family's ownings, that's a story. That's a narrative. He tells virtually nothing. And why did he do it? Because stories stick with us more than anything else. More than any other thing, stories stick with us. What are movies? Stories. What are novels? Stories. Those are things that stick with you. And sometimes sci-fi and fantasy sticks with you better than real books about real things. C.S. Lewis was a fan of both. And so not only did he read a ton of both, he wrote a ton of both. He was the professor of Middle Ages English at Oxford and Cambridge. And so he was known as a true scholar in that. But that really was, and they made fun of him. The Inklings, anybody know the name Inklings? The Inklings were the name of all his friends who he met at the pub every day. And they'd talk about the stuff they're working on. Guys like this guy named J.R.R. Tolkien and Charles Williams, who wrote War in Heaven, fantastic book. They wrote all these fantasies, but he wrote books for children, which they just harassed him forever until they started reading his paychecks for doing it. So, but those are books that last forever. And your job is to try to attract people to the concept and the wonder and the beauty of looking at God in some way. We had a mentor from Florida. What was his name, honey? Do you remember? Okay. Yeah, we'll think of it in a second. Morris Bergquist, an old Swedish guy, was just one of my main mentors. And he stood up in front. I pulled him out to do a camp 35 years ago. And he had a bunch of really staunch holiness people, which is Church of God, most of Sierra Pines has no idea what that even looks like. But these are very, this is them having fun. This is them in spiritual ecstasy. One hand, So they just sit on it, and he'd say, one time he stood up there and he said, is God fascinating? Yes. Is he interesting? Yes. He went through all these superlatives, and he said, at the end of it, he says, I have just read you Webster's dictionary version of entertainment. And he said, and yet if I said anything about somebody entertaining in the church, you would think that was the most awful thing you ever heard. He says, I think a pastor who cannot fascinate his people. He's got them for 1 hour. They're out there for 168 more hours a week. You get them for a half an hour, and if you cannot fascinate them with the concept and the beauty and the wonder and the hugeness of God in that time, you need to go pump gas somewhere. Because your call is to make people fall in love with God. And I've taken that personally ever since. We use humor, use anything at our disposal. Back to narrative. You want them to live in the moment that they're in front of you. You want them to live the moment that they are in that you're describing. So she wasn't used to being around people. She was even less used to being in town or in a crowd. She detested the very idea of it. So as she shuffled up the road with the throng surrounding her closely next to her, she just pulled in a breath, said, you've got to do this. I've got to do this. Even if I don't want to, I have to do this. She had tried everything else. Over the last 12 years, it had emptied her pocketbook and even her very will to live. She was beyond hope. No one had been able to solve her problem. Her physical condition made her persona non grata. She was not a desired presence in any location. No one wanted her around. She was unclean. Disgusting, frankly. And like the lepers she had seen at a distance, people considered her with a mixture of horror, of revulsion, disgust, and she knew it. You might see a leper's condition with your eyes at a distance, but when you came close to her in proximity, you knew it by the odor in the air, which frankly smelled like death. It was a time when laundry and hygiene products were rare to the point of non-existence, and her very private issue became way, way too public. She could have no husband. She could have no children. She could not gather with others at the tabernacle or the temple. She could not even go into town. She was ordered to stay outside of the town at all times. And even out there, nobody wanted to be close to her because it was just too much. She would have watched people retch when they came close to her, just out of physical response. They had no choice. She was on her own and essentially seen in the day, even by Greeks and Romans and by her own people, as cursed by God himself. She was condemned. As she walked with the hundreds surrounding her, hoping to reach the man up there at the lead of this column of people, she understood that everyone wanted to speak to him. She wasn't alone in this. Everyone wanted to talk to this guy. Everyone wanted a piece of him. Everyone wanted to touch him. They all wanted his attention. There was no chance that she might be able to speak to him. And even if she could get close enough to him, more than likely, as all others, he would not want anything to do with her at all because she was unclean. But she'd heard again and again about this guy. He was from her own area, Galilee. And she'd heard just over the past few years, he had become known as a wise man and even a miraculous worker of things no one else could do. And so she thought, maybe, just maybe. People called him rabbi, even though he did not wear rabbinical robes. He didn't have those fancy things that came to the ground with tassels on the bottom, that if you could even touch the tassel, the word was, if you could even touch those tassels, you might get a miracle. It'd be like the pool of Siloam or something, if you could just touch that. And that's the way these men held themselves. They were that high above everyone else. And she thought, he didn't wear those rabbinical robes, and yet everybody was calling him rabbi. He just wore the common robe of a common workman. He would be like Andy wearing an electrical belt over Levi's. And yet she thought, maybe. As she struggled forward in the close quarters of the crowd, it became her very condition that allowed her to make some space ahead after a while, because when she came close, people would sniff the air around them and all of a sudden would look at her with disgust and revulsion and jump back, not wanting to touch her. To touch her is like touching nuclear waste, because if you did, you'd be sent outside the city yourself. If you touched her, you'd be sent outside the city yourself and kept in quarantine until you were considered clean and have to go through a series of cleansing things before you would even be allowed back in. And in the meantime, everybody looked at you as if you had COVID-19. So it effectively opened a path. Finally, she was within one person's length away from him. She was just about there when all of a sudden a man came screaming and yelling and crying from the other direction down the hill toward them. A man was not just merely a man who was a rabbi was running toward him in full regalia, a man who was the head of their synagogue in that town. And he fell on his knees in front of this street preacher and started crying to him, just in absolute desperation. Oh, please, please, oh, please. I've tried everything. Please help me. My daughter, my little daughter, is dying. And if you don't come, could you just come and put your hands on her? I've tried everything. I've got nothing. Could you just put your hands on her and maybe she could live? Now, this encounter had stopped the crowd like a brick wall as they waited to see the dramatic outcome that would come from this, because these are two natural enemies. Somebody from the rabbinical tribe of Phariseeism and somebody who is a street preacher who is considered to be down here by those and considered a virtual threat to the Israeli kingdom of religiosity. And so they stood back to see what would happen. And now was her moment. As everybody stood back with bated breath, she got down on one knee and reached her hand through the crowd and just brushed the bottom of his robe. Then she pulled it back. And then she stood back up, hoping no one had seen what she did, and she just held her breath and looked at the ground. And suddenly, she felt a warmth in her abdomen. And then it began to radiate through her body, and especially in the portion of her body that had brought her nothing but shame and despite and all those horrible things that no one wants to feel, had been a weight like 1 billion pounds on her soul for the last 12 years. And it brought her nothing but suffering and heartache and crushing loneliness. But suddenly she was as light as a feather. She felt as clean as the whitest dove. She was being released. And she looked around her to see if anybody else noticed what she looked like, what she was going through, and no one did. But as she looked up away from herself and looked around, she saw the miracle worker started to look around, and he said, "Who touched me? Who touched my clothing?" Her heart leaped to her throat. Oh no. No one said anything. In fact, people started backing away because now he was acting threatening. And they saw the power of his conviction. She stood back too. No one said anything till finally one of his disciples who followed with him said, Rabbi, everyone's been touching you. What do you mean, who touched you? You're in a crowd. They're all crushing in on you. Of course they've touched you. He says, I know, but I felt power go out from me. Who touched my robe? And he began to scan the crowd again. People backed up again. As his eyes were about to come across to her, she could not take it any longer, and she fell forward on her face in front of him and said, it's me, it's me, it's me. I did it. I touched the bottom of your robe. I'm so sorry, but if you only understood, for the last 12 years I've been so miserable, so lonely. I've lost everything I ever had. I have nothing left. I have no friends. I have no family. I am by myself outside of the city in the condemned zone. I've got nothing, and you are my last hope. I am so sorry. It was me. I did it. And then she just stared at the dirt for quite a length of time, until finally she knew she had to look up and to see what her punishment was going to be. She expected to be condemned once again, as she had by everyone else. Only when she looked up, she saw the broad smile of a Messiah who was looking at her like this with a smile. He said a few words, but it wasn't the few words that he said. It was the first word that changed her world. It shifted her world on its axis, that changed everything about her entire life in one word, because she who had been reviled by everyone else, she who belonged to no one else, she who could contribute to no one else, he said one word. He said, daughter, daughter. With that one word, she was included. With that one word, she was healed. With that one word, far more healed than simply an issue of blood. She was made blood kin to him who was her most closest lover of her soul. No one else needed to love her because he had called her daughter, as if she was his own. And then he said, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go and finally be free from your suffering. We all have our issues, whether they're issues of blood or whether they're issues of feeling like we don't belong anywhere, or issues of stuff we've done in our past, or issues of things that people have done to us. We've got issues. Everybody's got issues. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And it's not just sin that we have done. There's sins of omission, sins of commission, sins of the things that people have done to us, and we feel reviled and estranged, a stranger in a strange land, wherever we are, at whatever age. When you were young in the 7th grade, I'll bet you thought many times you didn't belong anywhere. When you get older and you're 70 plus years old, after a while you feel like I'm not needed anywhere anymore. It happens to the best. I spoke a sermon last week or a week before that, using this sort of model as an idea that everybody is lonely. And an older lady came up to me afterwards, and this is just to prepare you for ministry, and just read me the riot act. I was just sorely mistaken. She had to take huge issue with my sermon. I said, oh, that's interesting. Why? And she says, I'm never lonely. I said, you live by yourself, right? She says, yes, but I'm never lonely. And I said, tell me why that is. She says, Jesus is always there with me. I said, I aspire to be as completed as you, but that's not where I am. I have thousands of Facebook friends. I've got tons of people who care about me. I've got a beautiful wife who would do anything for me and has stuck with me for many, many years. And yet, in the center of me, I have this thing that philosophers call existential loneliness. Just to exist, you feel lonely. There's a belongingness that you never quite fill. And Pascal called it an empty vacuum that nothing can fill except the person of God, except God in the person of Jesus Christ alone. Nothing else will fill it. And I'm working on it. And finally, she asked me a couple of questions, and then she said, I can't talk to you anymore, and she left. She stormed out the door. The joys of ministry. The fact is unless, and maybe you're at a place you could say, I never feel lonely. I would say this, I'm never alone. I'm very rarely alone. Sometimes I wish I could be alone, but I'm never alone, and he is always with me. But I am lonely sometimes, and that's all part of this. When it comes to this, we find that we sometimes are the woman with an issue of something, whether it's an issue of blood, or whether it's an issue of mental illness, or whether it's an issue of depression, whatever it might be. We have issues. And then sometimes we are the robe that clings so close to our master that someone else can come up and merely touch our lives and be healed because we're the hem of his garment. The choice is up to us and how closely we watch with him. Now that's an example of just narrative at an amateur style. Does that make the word come a little bit more alive at all? And that's what you're really trying to do, because people's lives are moving so quickly right now. If I could say there's a mental illness that has struck all of humankind, it's that we're moving so fast we don't get any depth out of it anymore. You can travel across the country in an airplane at 35,000 feet from LA to New York and say, I've seen the country. Been there, done that. I've been across the U.S. It's a little different than driving across the country, isn't it? Which is a little bit different than riding your 10-speed across the country. Do they still make 10 speeds? I don't know. Which is a little bit different than walking across the country and stopping along the way and talking to farmers and people who invite you in, and it's different. I'd say America is sick to their stomach right now with motion sickness. We're moving so quickly, we don't get any depth anymore. We're skating on the top of the water, and our souls are starving for depth. Take people deep. To me, narrative is the way you can take people deep. But in order to do this, now suddenly you're going to have to study, and you'll see why. I'm going to give you a piece of paper right now that basically is the Chris Brown method of this thing. In fact, if I've got two each, I'm going to give you two so that you can write on one and you can keep the other for future development. Okay, whatever you're going to say. This is Chris Brown's method. Let me give you some more. I've got some more over here. It's made in nice green color because Heather Sconce was very kind and made it even nicer than Chris Brown's copy. Give me here again. You need two. In fact, you need 4 or 5. Okay, so we'll start with this. We'll take a break and we'll complete it in a little bit because I got a little bit of classwork for you to do. And you'll see how this thing works. The narrative matrix. This is Chris. Like I say, look up Chris Brown from North Coast, and then you'll get an example of what just makes me really hate this guy. You know, I hate him kind of like I hate Spurgeon, because it's just too good. It just makes it. If you get a chance to this is a little bit heady. I know I bought the staff and board some years ago a really nice little copy of Morning and Evening, which is the the thing by C.H. Spurgeon. And, just read one of those things. It'll take you, it's only this long, but it'll take you about, normally you'd read that much in a minute and a half. This one is going to take you about 5 or 6 minutes as you go, what's he saying? What's he saying? And remember, this guy never went to school, and he had 3,500 people going to his church who were illiterate. Okay, they didn't understand, and yet they had a bigger vocabulary than your 4-year graduate from a bachelor's degree today. Why? Because they were moving slower. Has anybody looked at the handwriting in the Constitution? Anybody read anything by Jefferson and those guys from back in the day? And you go, man, these guys were flat out deep. They had time to be. We don't. So, okay. Chris looks at it through this narrative matrix for understanding and communicating Bible through story. And I could tell you this will work whether you're going to develop a movie or whether you're going to develop a story, a novel or a short story or whatever you're doing. This will assist you as a developmental tool to do that. And it's just incredible. So he's got 4 lenses. He's got the lens of geography, the lens of characters, the lens of context, and the lens of hermeneutics. Okay, in other words, interpretation of Scripture. And these things are all out here on the outside. In the middle, you've got the biblical text you're looking at. So as you look at the text, you read it, and then you begin to ask yourself these questions. In terms of lens of geography, that scope that goes up like this, in terms of that, you say, what is in the immediate area to this person? So in this story that I just used, this woman has come up and wants to touch Jesus in some way for healing. But, okay, she comes up, she touches the bottom of his robe, she's healed. Done. It loses some dimension, doesn't it? Okay? I want you to smell that. I didn't quite get you there. I should have had you sniffing the dust that they'd been kicking up with their sandals the whole way. And she should have been choking out a little bit from that. And you'd been able to smell of that. Have you ever walked in a crowd of people at a fair or something like that, and all the dust is coming up, you're going, oh, I think I'm going to die. Well, you want them to feel that. If somebody's cooking, if grandma's cooking an apple pie next door, you want to smell it. So, and some of those senses, you've got 5 of them. I'd say you really have 6 of them, because you can take all 5, put them together, and you create yet another sense that creates a intuition, if you will. So, but what's in the immediate area? For her, it was people right here, right here, right here. Why? Because she was walking up the road behind Jesus of Nazareth, and there were literally hundreds, if not thousands of people in that same line. And she's trying to get in his proximity. So she's going to be crowded out by people. People are pushing, people are pushing people away, aren't they? Are they? Does anybody know people? People just do this. They're after their own thing. But she has an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is that, or the disadvantage is that she's a woman, and she's really not even supposed to be in that crowd, in a sense, following Jesus, because only men are supposed to be following a rabbi. That's why Mary Magdalene got in such trouble whenever she was around there. So all those things are things to consider. So you consider the immediate area, and then you consider the local area where she was, okay? And then you consider the surrounding area. I've got another one I used for the blind young man at the gate and it tells a whole pre-story, and then Jesus comes up to the gate with tons of people that are following him, and this blind young man is sitting at the gate. His parents have cried because he has to finally start begging now. There's no other way. If they die, he won't survive, so his dad takes him down to the gate every day and sets him there, and he is smelling. I knew what time of year, because I did a little research to find out what time of year he was sitting at the gate and what kind of flowers were in the distance. And so I described all that he's sitting there, and because his other senses have heightened. And you lose a sense, your other senses become more acute. And so he could smell these heady wildflowers off in the distance, and I forget the name of them. You'll have to read my text I wrote. I'll put some of these out to you guys as time goes on, as I rediscover them in my computer. So literally, you feel like you're this young man. And if you recall, he's the young man that Jesus comes up and asks him if he wants to be healed. Duh. Only it's not duh, because that's the way he makes his living. There's people in India right now that will cut off their children's legs so they have a way to make a living as a beggar. The same thing was happening. That's the Far East, or the Near East, excuse me. And you starve to death. There is no social safety net for blind people or deaf people or broken people. And then Jesus, if you'll recall, spits in the mud and puts it on his eyes. And then what's he tell him to do? Anybody remember that? Huh? Go wash them off. Where?
In the pool.
In the pool of Siloam, which is in the center of the city. And he's out on the outer edge. So now he's going to have to walk blind through all these alleyways by himself. Dad's not helping him. He's going to have to walk blind and find his way through the city with mud on his eyes. What will people be saying to him along the way? So you put yourself in the moment. You relive the moment that he's there. And you put yourself in his head as he struggles with these things. Till finally he gets down. He's going to give up hope a zillion times. He's going to wipe it off and just say, this is stupid. But he finally makes it the whole distance, and he goes through the moment of transformation. And then nobody believes him. And they pull him in front of the authorities. And they say, who did this? And he says, I don't know. All I know is I once was blind, and now I see. That's where that came from. These are fantastic stories told at their depth. They're just stories in 2-dimension. So the reason I love this method, although I don't do it that often because it's costly, to do it takes you literally 4 or 5 times the amount of time. But you're going to learn to write it and develop it with this matrix here that he's put together. And the first thing you look at is the lens of geography. What's happening in the world around you? In my case, I was thinking about this young guy smelling the flowers in the distance. If you're sitting on a street in Jerusalem, what are you going to hear come rumbling by every now and then? Roman soldiers. Scary as all get out. These guys are literally nuclear bombs on horses compared to your capability to defend yourself. You couldn't harm them. They had full armor. They were muscled up. They were hard, gritty guys who were in a country they didn't want to be in. And frankly, if you gave them an excuse, they'd just take your head off. They just didn't want it. They were angry at everybody. And so you would watch them come by, and your guts are turning just a little bit every time they do. That's the lens of geography. And so you look at the physical surroundings. Are there mountains? Is it flat plain? Is there sand? Is there dirt? Can you smell things? What do you smell? What do you hear? That's the lens of geography. Then let's look over at lens of characters. Okay. Lens of characters. You look at that, and on that first line, just next to biblical text, you put main character. That little short line. Main character. In other words, who are we talking about here? And the next line up, you put crowd. Because actually there's usually always a crowd in acting out of the story. There's always going to be a crowd there. There's going to be some observers. Okay? Without observers, it kind of changes everything. And so you have the crowd, and then the last line outside the circle is what we call the concerned. These people are hardly ever mentioned, but they're there. This is what I call reading between the lines. In the case of the blind young guy I was talking about, do blind people have parents? Do you know anybody who has a kid that has a malfunction, that has issues? Mentally, physically, has had an illness. If you talk to them, you find out they're a concerned character, in the main character's life, big time. So when you tell the story of their kid, they're back there. In my family growing up, I had two brothers and a sister. My sister was the oldest. My next brother was older than me by 3.5 years. She was older by 7. Then there came me, and then I had a little brother who was mentally disadvantaged because they tried to force the birth at like the 4th or 5th month. They tried to force it, and he was oxygen deprived and became, I would say, maybe 2 years old, not even 2 years old, because 2-year-olds can talk. He couldn't talk. He couldn't use the restroom. And so basically he became just this, we belonged to the Sacramento Association of Retarded Children. And we became friends with those people. And I never had friends over because my friends would not understand this very awkward brother. But that formed my life. That was part of what formed who I was. And I look at people now, we've had many people in the church who have had children who were mentally disadvantaged and had issues. And my heart goes out to them because once you have that child, your life is put on hold. Your life spins around that child. Mom and dad, growing up, we always had somebody in to care for them, or mom and dad had to be there, and that whole thing goes on. No matter what, in the people around your life, you have concerned characters. Your parents, your aunts and uncles, your friends, those people, and they're all part of the story. Now, the reason I bring this up is because when you create a narrative, you can take advantage of the untold story of the concerned character that isn't going to be told anywhere else and is not explicitly mentioned within the text of the Bible. It is implicit. In other words, it's not said on the front of the page, but it's implied, implicit in the text. So did this blind kid have parents? Did they have heartache over this kid? Was there tears shed at some point? Yeah, especially in their culture, there would have been, because they saw this as a curse from God on them. You recall when one of the disciples asked Jesus, who caused this guy to be born this? Was it sin of his parents or his sin? Does anybody remember that part? Okay, that's physiognomy. That's also in the Greek world. If you saw somebody who looked bizarre and misshapen and whatever, they're cursed by God. If you're blind, you're cursed by God. If you're deaf, you're cursed by God. You're less. You're less than. You're an outsider. That's called physiognomy. Physiognomy. And that's how people just judge things. In fact, for a long, long time, up until 100 years ago, they felt like they could feel the bumps on your head and tell your psychology. Anybody ever seen that? My daughter has an old model of that. That's how people looked at things. So when people saw somebody in bad shape, so the concerned characters, to tell that story, I told some of the story of his parents before he ever went out and sat there. The woman who Jesus talked to at the well, were there other concerned characters that you don't hear anything about but are implied? 5 husbands. Was there a story to why they left? Was there issues? Were they just, what would you bet? Were they men of good character, all of them? Anybody betting? Come on, bet. Prognosticate. Huh?
They just wanted to use her.
They just wanted to use her.
Or was she a nag?
Huh?
Yeah. Or was she a nag?
Or was she a nag? This is possible. Okay? And any one of those things would have made her feel less than wanted and feel pushed out. So these are all stories. Could they be developed? Would they be absolutely accurate? I would tell you, in making of a sermon, and there will be people who disagree, strict exegetical guys will disagree. I will tell you the Bible needs to come alive. And any one of these stories that you developed, let's say that she was an egg. Why was she an egg?
Maybe from her upbringing.
Huh?
Maybe she didn't know better, maybe from her parents.
Maybe from her parents. Maybe she was raised in a perfectionistic home and she could never reach that. And so she kept, we call that projection. You projected on everybody else. Okay, so yeah.
Maybe the first husband died and none of the rest could compare.
Ooh.
Maybe,
Could you develop that theme in the narrative? And this woman is going to the well and at the middle of the day, in the heat of the day, because no one else will be out there. That's the reason she went. You all know that one. And she went there because she didn't want to have to deal with anybody else's stares, because she was a perfectionist herself. And she was judgmental herself, perhaps. But this had led to the final payday of 5 people who had left her, one perhaps by death, who no one could compare to, you know. And man, you could develop that so much in her. Would there be anybody in this congregation or audience you'll ever preach to that would understand that to the core, where it would reach them? And they go, there's so many themes that could be developed from this. And I would tell you that it's truer than the truth, because it's true to a whole lot of people when you tell that story. So the concerned, they're hardly ever mentioned, but boy, are they important. They are so, so important. I'll give you a description of that in a bit. Okay, biblical text, back to that. We're going to move down the lens of context. There's a spiritual context, that's the closest line. There's a political context. There's an economic context. Okay, when the text is speaking toward spiritual things and then political, no matter if you're in the Old Testament, you're going to be talking about, you might be talking about when Israel was under the mighty hand of Egypt, the political context in that, and what that all meant. When you finally do homework like this, the movie that plays in your head will not be like Cecil B. DeMille's movie with Moses. Because Moses had one of those little things in the back of his head, like a ponytail, as the rest of his head was shaved. How do I know that? He was the adopted son of Pharaoh. That went with the game. Was it Mike? Did you mention that? No, somebody mentioned the eunuch today. Was that? That was what now? Andrew Adams did. You'd be surprised how many people don't know what a eunuch is and how that eunuch became a eunuch, okay, at a young age. Has anybody ever heard the term castrata before? If you're in music, you know what a castrata is. A castrata is a young person, a young guy who has a beautiful voice, and then to keep that voice forever, it's a beautiful soprano voice, they castrate him. Castrata. That's like a eunuch. Why did they leave eunuchs? Why did they make eunuchs? Because they're totally trustworthy when they're taking care of their women. How about Daniel? What was he? Eunuch. This plays into the depth of the story so much more. Do you think that he suffered because of his being a eunuch? And the Ethiopian eunuch, who was not allowed to go into the inner courts of the temple, not even the temple itself, because he was a eunuch, and that's considered unclean by Jews. Okay, is there anybody out there who feels like they can't come in here because they're unclean? Yeah. And our job is to try to erase that sensibility and take it where Jesus wants to. And does Jesus demonstrate that? Yes. The whole New Testament, there's neither Greek nor Jew, slave nor free. And Philip just demonstrated it by his actions with the Ethiopian eunuch who he baptized. And then Philip was the first guy who Star Trek took on a ride to an entirely different zone, just like that. He was just, that's awesome. I don't know, I want to know. That's one of the questions I want to ask God. So how did that go down? You know, he just appeared and disappeared, and that was awesome. So all these stories, they can be fun. Okay, so you have spiritual context, spiritual text to to the problem or to the text. What are the spiritual values we can learn there? What's Jesus saying that hits you spiritually? What's the political backdrop to everything Jesus is saying? Render unto Caesar this day that which is Caesar's. And then we think, okay, Jesus is talking about money. No, money's the last thing he's talking about. He's not talking about money at all. He holds up the coin and he says, whose image is on this? And they say, Caesar. Give it to Caesar. Whose image is on you? Your imago Dei. You are made in the image of God. Render unto God this coin. Render unto God this. Give him this. All of it. Context. Spiritual context. Political context is in both of those. Economic context. So the woman is down to her last few ounces of olive oil and her last bit of wheat, and she's going to die. And this crazy looking lunatic guy shows up from the forest. Elijah. And says, trust me. Give me all of what you got and you'll get more. Right. Is there any economic context to 5,000 people eating from one boy's lunch? How much money? Is there any McDonald's back in those days? We're going to go into town. How are you going to get the food for 5,000 people? From anybody. Not just McDonald's, but all those things when they're brought into your story, as you're writing your story, then all these things are places to search out. So as you begin to write down your story, you don't tell everybody everything right at the beginning. One of mine starts out with, Andy woke up at the start. And what I envelop in that story is the story of Andrew. And Jesus is about ready to be taken away. And so this is change his name. If you want to see some really good examples of this, there was a great series, and I've got a couple of books. The rest of the story. What's his name? Paul Harvey. Look up the rest of the story. It's 2 paperbacks. If you can find them somewhere, read those, and you'll get a good example of how to hold your audience until the last, until they learn who it is you're talking about. Change the name slightly. Okay, so Andrew became Andy. Saul became Paul, as you know, but Saul means asked for and prayed for, and Paul means basically little guy, this little guy, and an approachable little guy. So you have this 2 characters in one. Don't tell everybody the whole story before you get there. Make them want it. Make them wait to find out the information, and then relieve the tension at the last. Every good movie, every good script, the Bible itself, we don't know what's going to happen until you get to Revelation. And then all this tension. Years ago, they had a big computer program that analyzed the Bible, and you may have heard of it. I think it was at Harvard, and the computer program came back with the notion this was written by one mind. It's just, yeah, it was. It was written by one mind. It's through many different hands, through different pens. Just an aside, you'll hear some guys who tried to dismantle the power of the Bible. Deconstructionist theologians, you'll find a lot of those at places like Harvard and Yale. And there's some good theologians there too, but most of them are very deconstructionist. They want to deconstruct the Bible, and they will say these are all myths. What's his name, who wrote Harvard Archaeological Review, stated that all the stories of the big miracles were not seen by large crowds. They're just made up myths, like the calming of the sea. Herschel Shanks is his name. it's really kind of important that over your life you read all these different negative guys so that you have an answer you develop later for them. You know, I've got my favorite enemies on my shelves, the most atheistic of atheists. I've read their stuff, and sometimes I've read them and think, man, they make a good argument. Man, this kind of messes me up for a while. When I was in the master's program in apologetics at Biola, it felt like they were putting me out on an ice floe and let me float out there with no hope, and I had to preach this Sunday. You know, it's like, this is horrible. But over time, then you would go, yeah, your argument doesn't hold, dude, and here's where it falls apart, okay? And I know I've shared this many times, but our best guys win in all the debates. The atheists don't win. We win because it's more logical when it comes down to it. God's more logical. He's more provable. I am totally of the conviction that the Bible is being more finely proven with every new discovery, whereas theirs tend to be falling apart. Evolution is falling apart. Most major evolutionists are leaving the game. You know, it's an interesting concept. And if a college student says, "Well, I believe in evolution," I say, "Okay, it's fine. If you want to believe in evolution, that's fine. But you still have a problem. What's that? Somebody had to start it, okay? And somebody has to be guiding this, because natural evolution will always lead you downwards. It's the second law of thermodynamics. Things fall apart. They come apart. Things don't build to greater complexity without design. So what are you going to do with that? If God chose to use theistic evolution, he was shooting across the universe at a target that's the size of a quantum particle, okay? He deserves even more applause if he did it that way. But the fact is, I don't see the upstanding proof that will hold. And so the more you get into it, at first glance, you'll hear these words and you'll think, oh, God's been disproven. Look deeper. Just look deeper. He hasn't been disproven. He is being more proven every day. So do you get the idea of our context thing? Now we're going to take a little break. We're going to come back, and I need you to find something to write on. I've got, and I'm only going to have you write just maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. That's it. And then you can use, you've got one of these. Did you bring one with you? No? You've got something you're writing on. You don't need that. Okay. So basically, you need something you can write on. I got this at a very expensive store, the dollar store, and they're awesome. Look at these things. This is awesome stuff. So, and just write on there, retold stories. Okay, retold stories. And retold stories by Andy. And you go and find a story in the Bible, and there's a gazillion of them, and then you retell it. But you fill it in with all the stuff we can't see, looking through all these contexts. What's going on around them? What's going on in the road, right down the road? What are they hearing? What are they feeling? What are they tasting? What have they had for breakfast today? What were their mom and dads like? Okay, for the first thing I'll have you do is you're going to be out on the fishing boat in the middle of the night when Jesus went over there, crossed ahead, and they're out fishing, and he comes to them walking on water. Okay? But you're going to start, and here's the deal. You know the concerned parties? Normally, see, you would be going with Peter on that one, wouldn't you? Because Peter's going to walk on water, right? And you say, oh, Peter. Well, what are the other guys seeing? So you can use Peter. That's a good one. But what are the other guys doing that didn't have the guts to get out of the boat? Okay, what about that? Now afterwards, they're a little jealous, aren't they? Okay, because Peter actually came out looking pretty good after it was all said and done. We all like to make fun of him. Well, he didn't have faith, he fell in the water. Yeah, like, what would you do? You know? But you can, as they're getting in the boat, this boat, by the way, was about from here. This is not a big boat. This is about from here to about here. That's the boat. It's kind of like a big fat canoe. And if you've seen, go online and look at the Jerusalem boat. You ever heard of this one? The Jerusalem boat is something they dug out of the mud here about 25, 30 years ago. And it is considered to, when they found it, they dated it to exactly the time that Jesus lived in the Sea of Galilee. They dug it out of the mud, and as soon as it was coming out of the mud, it began to disintegrate. So they had this fantastic team come out from the Historical Society and all this that basically put it back together. Now it sits in a museum in Israel, and we've seen it. We were there, and you're going, okay, so there's how many people on this boat? Egad, 12 or 13 people on this boat. And the waves are like, like as tall as the top of those things right there coming at you. Would you feel a little upset? The boat was not made for deep water. It was made for shallow water. They always hung around the outside of the water. You know the kind of fish they got? This blew my mind. I thought this was a recent development. I thought somebody developed this fish. No, tilapia. Tilapia is what they went fishing for. And they caught it in the shallows of the water, and that's where they hung out all the time. But in this case, they're going across the Sea of Galilee. It's really a big lake. Okay, they're going across the Sea of Galilee. The wind has whipped the waves up huge, and they are in fear of their life. And then they see at nighttime, and we don't know, was it a full moon? Was it a new moon? No moon at all. What was it? Well, I'm going to go with the most likelihood if I'm making up a story. It's going to be halfway between, because the moon is always twice as often half full as it is either empty or full. Okay, so I'm going to go with that. You're not getting a lot of light, but you're seeing in the midst of all this thing coming across, there's a white figure coming across the water. And what do they start screaming and yelling? And on top of being absolutely catastrophically panicked out to their core and exhausted, it's a what? It's a ghost. And they believed in ghosts back then. Little sideline, America for the first 100 years, I mean, until we came up with electricity, people were scared to death of dark. Just scared to death of it, because dark can hide all kinds of fearsome things. They would use language like this: nightfall. That's where the term came. Night fell like an evil thing. And so they would wear nightcaps on their head to keep the evil stuff from coming into their head. Remember me with the nightcap, me with my nightcap, mom with or whatever. That's what all that came from. And so they believed in that. When Peter got out of jail and went knocking on the door, and the little gal at the door answered the door and immediately shut him out and said it was Peter's what? Ghost. It was his angel, they called it, but it was, same thing, And so they had a lot of what empirical science has ripped some of that wonder away from us, but thank God it's filled in we got some light bulbs now. So you get the idea. But you write from the experience of the context. Remember this, write it down somewhere in your hermeneutics. I didn't do hermeneutics, did I? Okay, I guess I have to do that one. Okay, so hermeneutics, what does it say? Next line is, what does it mean to me? And the top one out there is application. How do I apply this? So what does it say? What does it mean to me in applications? And what I would layer over all that is, you've heard me say it before, never take a text out of context. It creates a pretext. Never take a text out of context. It creates a pretext. So when you're studying the Bible, you have to be open-minded. What is it saying to the person then? What does it say? Remember, an awful lot of what you're reading, say, for instance, in the King James Version of the Bible, is what makes sense to a 1600s Englishman. So when Paul says, it is a shame for a woman to cut her hair, does anybody remember this one? It's a shame for a woman to cut her hair. My grandma, who belonged to a different phase of the Church of God, a different entire Church of God holiness organization, never cut her hair for the entirety of her life. It was on the ground. She wound it up every day and put it on top of her head because that was pleasing to God. She did not have any wedding rings. No one did. In fact, in the early Church of God, of this Church of God, no one wore wedding rings. No one wore anything because that was called adornment. Okay, adornment. And that was not godly. Okay, so they didn't do that. What is Paul speaking to, though? He is not saying it is a shame for a woman to cut her hair per se. He is saying to the Ephesians, he is saying women who cut their hair to look like those temple prostitutes in their availability to men around them, they're the ones that walk with their sandals or without their sandals, and it says on their left foot, it says follow. On the right foot is tattooed under there, me, follow me. Because if you wanted to be in touch with God, you could touch and read Dan Brown's stuff. If you follow me to the temple and have relations with me, that's you touching God. That's your moment of touching God. Yeah, well, I told the church for years, no wonder they were a very popular church at the time. Women would say, where are you going, honey? I'm going to church. So basically, read the thing in context. Is it a shame for a woman to cut her hair? No. It is if you're trying to look like the Kardashians in an effort that men would desire you in that manner, and you're doing that from your heart. It's not my job to judge that, okay? But there's obviously women would cut their hair very short, and you knew immediately they were a temple prostitute. So, but you had Christian gals or Jewish gals that would cut their hair in like manner to tease. Does that make any sense? So is Paul saying it's a shame for a woman to cut her hair, or it's really a shame for a woman to copy the sex symbols of the world so that somebody will want to go and have sex with them? Go for deeper things. Go for the deeper qualities of life. So that's really what he was saying. Always be careful of what you take out of context. Let me give you one more before we go. One of the other discussions this gal had with me a couple weeks ago was I had gone through the wonder of God thinking about you before the beginning of the foundation of the earth. Has anybody read anything like that in the Bible? In other words, he created everything, and there's a moment of creation. That's what blew a lot of the atheistic philosophers off their ladder back in 1992 when Big Bang was proven, because it said everything had a beginning. It sounded really cool for a moment until 3 days later they figured out that implies you have to have a beginner. Oh no. Who said that? And it's, I forget what's his name, from Goddard Space Center said, it's kind of funny. You've got these philosophers been sitting around for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, and you finally climbing the hill of knowledge, and you get up to the top of the hill of knowledge only to find out there was a bunch of theologians sitting there the whole time. So basically, I don't have anybody in the game for the young earth, old earth concept. You've all heard of this conflict within the pale of orthodoxy. We've got people who believe on both ends of the scale. We have people who believe that the universe was started 13.8 billion years ago, and the earth started 4.5 billion years ago, and life began in its most primary forms 2.5 billion years ago, and blah, 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 blah. And that doesn't mean they believe in evolution, by the way. You have to parse this all out. But they believe that God, when it says on the first day, the word for day is the Hebrew word yom. That's another place to begin in your search of creating a sermon. Is go back to the original language. And you don't even need a big book this big anymore to do that. You just look online in a search bar, and there's I don't even go there. I've got thousands of dollars worth of computer programs and books, and now I just go into the search bar, and it gives me all of it for free. Boom, like that. And I can look up in my book, and it's what my book says, because it's quoting my book. And so, the word yom can mean one of two things. a period of time or a 24-hour day. Either one. It's not dictating that. And so, I may say to you, on my grandfather's day, living on the prairie in Kansas, they didn't have any ice cream. You say, your grandfather only lived a day? Do you get the problem here? In my grandfather's day. Well, you said your grandfather's day. No, that's not what I meant. In the time that he lived in the epoch of time he lived in. So, in the first day, this happened. In the second day, this happened. In the third day. Remember, in the first day, there wasn't even a light in the sky. There's no sun, there's no moon, there's no 24-hour day for measurement. Okay? So, it wasn't until the fourth day, right? And so Hugh Ross came up with this years ago. He's the author of, he's the guy that started Reasons to Believe, Science Coming Together with. He says there's no problem. What do you mean? The Bible is still exactly true. It's just you're reading it wrong, And so what I tell this gal said, you don't believe in that Big Bang thing. And I said, that's one way God could have done it. Yes, he can do anything he wants. He's God. With the Lord, 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years, right? Anybody heard that part? God doesn't look at time like we do. 13 billion years, I couldn't do it in 13 billion years. Can anybody else get it done in 13? For one thing, I don't live 13 billion years, okay? That's a real big precluder. God can do anything he wants. To him, it's like that. He can be here, he can be there. He can be everywhere. So he's the beginning and the end. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He is the very definition of time. He's the guy who holds time in his hands. He created time. Time is a created construct within the three-dimensionality of our universe, of which he lives outside of and inside of at the same time. He can do anything he wants. So, boy, she did not like that. Okay, that just lost me forever to her. And I recognized, here's one last trick. I recognized I should have done what I have done. I've learned things and I have forgotten things. And I come back to learning them all over again with a slap in the face. Okay? What I should have said to her, you don't believe in that Big Bang, do you? I should have said, what do you believe? And then she, well, I certainly don't believe in that. What do you believe? Well, I believe in 7 24-hour days. Well, that's a reasonable construct. God could do that. So you have to figure out how to sidestep, because you're going to have people who will disallow you because you believe in young earth or old earth. You will have people that disallow you. If I were to say to you, so, Andy, do gay people go to hell? Don't answer. That's a rhetorical question. Young pastors are going to be asked that question. And when you are asked that question, we are told to answer with respect, and we're called to answer with gentility. And so you have to stop and take a breath. And like I think I may have shared with you, I had a gay gal who was very precious to us years ago. She asked me, she took me out to lunch and she said, okay, so what does God think about this gay thing? And I said, what do you think he thinks? That was brilliant of me. God gave me that because I wouldn't have thought of that. And she says, no, you tell me, you're the expert. And I said, I'm not doing your homework for you. You need to find that out on your own, because I'm not. Why are you asking me? I don't have anything to say about it. I'm not your judge. Okay? What you need to ask is God. What does he think about that? Fine. Where do I look? And I told her I would start with Romans chapter 1. And she went there, and it was a beautiful thing. We have remained very deep friends, very, very, very deep friends. In today's culture, if you don't have at least 5 or 6 gay friends, you're not getting around much. But they all need to be loved. And they need to be loved before you hit them with judgment. And your job isn't to judge them anyway. You won't be sitting on the throne at the end of time. And if God is judging, let me follow this through. I have to follow it through. If God is judging sexual sin at the end of time, how many guys in the room are in trouble? Let me tell you how you're in trouble. If you look at a woman with lust in your heart, okay, everybody's in trouble. Because we were made to be desirous of that by visual. And so if he's going to judge that, had I better withhold whatever I'm saying about anybody else who may have a sexual sin in your life? You bet. But does that let him off the hook? No, no more than it lets me off the hook. So is God going to judge? Yes. What does he say about these things? Read it carefully. That's what I would say. Read it carefully. If I were you, I'd read it carefully. Because I do know this, and I told her this. I said, this I know. I said, do Linda and I love you? And she said, yes. And you're convinced of that completely? She said, yes. And I said, we're just human, and we love you. God loves you about 10 kabillion, zillion, billion, zillion, jillion, zillion more times than I do. And he says when he gets a hold of you, he's never going to let go. I would do my best to please him, not because you're scared of him, but because he loves you. And I try to live my life according to that. So you will have a condemning factor within your brain. We call it the round table of all the every authority figure you've ever had in your life, your parents, your uncles, your aunts, your teachers, everybody else that sits in this table, this invisible table inside your head. It's called your committee. And they sit up there, and you can feel them. They don't say anything particularly, but every time you do something that's a little bit disappointing to you, oh, I'm just such a jerk. I should be thrown out somewhere on the road. I don't match up. And Jesus is saying, I'm so glad you came to me, because now you're healed. And now you can finally go get that life you're after. It's me. I love you because I love you. Period. Do we need guidelines? Yeah, but we can't hit anybody else over the head with a hammer. It just doesn't work. It doesn't draw anybody to Christ. You go to places you're loved. And that's why we developed this. We have people who have been crazier than hoot owls in their lives. But they have come to know Jesus. And I could go through a long list of these guys, Flint Tompkins, Kenny Jordan, people that have just lived the most hellacious lives, but have come to demonstrate the grace of Christ in such a way that many others have come to know him. It's when you're weak that he is strong. Well, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then what I'm going to make you do next is you're just going to write your first lines of a story. I'm putting you on the boat out there in the middle of the night. You have to, and there's one last thing on your chart. You need to draw up in the right-hand corner your best artistic rendition of a boulder. Boulder, just a big boulder, and it's going to have a little stick person that's sitting on it. That's you. When you want to develop this stuff, you go sit on the boulder and you just think. You just freewheel. You don't think any particular thing. You don't let yourself get drawn down a rabbit hole. You just brainstorm, we call it. Anything's possible. What's going on? You know? How long is their hair? How long has it been since they had a bath? What's that seem like in their culture? I mean, my dad always asked me, why do people have to take a bath every day? We only took a bath every Saturday night, going to church on Sunday. Out there in the farm all week long, all these people wasting all this money and water. And I'm not kidding. And if you talk to anybody who was born somewhere between 1900 and 1930, and you're going to find they all say the same thing. Bathtubs, less than 10 or 15% of households across America had a bathtub in 1910. What do they smell like? My dad said it's just good honest sweat, good honest human stink. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. When I retired, I was off for about 3 or 4 months, and it made perfect sense to me. It didn't to Linda. She'd come home after 3 days. I haven't even hit the shower. They're just going, oh, this is great. I don't have to take a shower anymore. Anyway, so we'll take a small break, but what I want you to do is write the first 3 lines. I don't know who your character is, and you can choose another story in the Bible if you want to, and just write 3 or 4 lines. That's it. It does not have to be in any way good. Here's what's required. The pencil or pen just needs to hit the paper. That's all. Just make it move.
How much
And-
time do we need for research?
Well, tonight you won't have any, but unless you just brought your Bible with and you can look that up, you know. But this is, can you see how this can help a Bible study? Can make a Bible study go 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional really. Because when you can smell things, that's different. And really, I try to usually put some sort of smell factor in there because smelling is the most ancient of our senses. It's what I have done so many funerals in my life, but when I talk to a widow and I say, what's the thing that pulls it all back for you? They say, when I walk in his closet, I smell his clothes. I lose it because I smell him. It brings him present. So you use those things because another issue I told my kids as they were growing up, my 2 youngest are in showbiz, and my youngest is a comedian, and my next one up, Jake, is also a comedian, actor, musician, and we taught them, you know, you got to make them, they always learn this, they say it to me all the time. I know, Dad, got to make them laugh, got to make them cry. You make them laugh because when they come in here, they've been having an issue with the people they lived with. And they're angry, and they kick the dog on their way out, and they're just, you know, they're tied up in some of their issues that are just overtaking them. When they start to laugh, and they walk in like this, body language, you all know body language. When their arms are crossed, their legs are crossed, what's it mean? I'm closed. Lay off of me, man. Just stay out of me. But when they start to laugh, their arms come uncrossed. They become more vulnerable. And that's when you expend the pathos, the stuff that is emotional. And why do we want them to feel emotion? Because logic never changed anybody's life. Emotion changes everybody's life. The most important decisions you've ever made in your life were made for emotional reasons. You did not marry her because she was a logical choice. In fact, you've probably told yourself many times since she was not a logical choice. No, I'm just teasing. You get the idea. But we do the most important. The house you bought is bought as much out of emotion as anything else. Everything you do that really matters in your life is emotional. So you've got to get granted access to their heart to speak to that, because when you speak to their heart, then they will take that away with them. They will not remember 90% of your sermon. They just don't. And in fact, what I tell most people, even the best sermonators, I've got a shirt that says sermonator, sermon deliverers, I would say they need to shorten it up by about 10 to 15%. And because you've said what you need to say, and they're not getting any more. They're not getting any more. Your brain, that cartoon of Gary Larson's that had this kid, huge kid with a small teeny head. He's sitting in the front row. He says to the teacher, can I be excused? My brain is full. That's how you feel many times. So anyway, okay, 5:43, and we're going to take a break, and then we're going to spend just 5 minutes sermon writing. And I'm going to go pay this guy back here.